Matthew's Gospel, from which I read just a few minutes ago, is the one of the four Gospels which is most clearly focused on the community of faith. Today we have entered the Gospel story at a critical juncture. The Galilean ministry of Jesus is about to end, and the story of the crucifixion about to begin. This is a decisive teaching moment for Jesus. Like a parent who suddenly becomes aware of all the things she has not taught her son before he goes away to college, Jesus begins to teach his disciples with renewed fervor. So much to say, so little time in which to say it. And his topic at this point is the community of faith. So Jesus talks about such routine matters as the nature of leadership in the Christian community and the role of pastoral care, what to do when there's conflict, and the importance of forgiveness in the community of God's people. He seems to focus almost exclusively on the practical and ethical matters of God's people in their life together. Though his earthly ministry is nearing its end, Jesus knows that the ministry of God will continue in and through the church. In fact, the church will take the good news of the gospel beyond Israel and even to the ends of the earth. As Jesus thinks about it, the church is far more than a group of people. The church is, in fact, to serve as a colony of the kingdom of heaven. A colony of the kingdom of heaven that is a people of God in the world. You will remember earlier in his teachings that Jesus has called God's people the salt of the earth, the light of the world, and the leaven of mercy. All of these metaphors speak of elements that bring dramatic transformation to whatever they touch. In his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, Tom Long, a Presbyterian pastor and professor, says it like this: when the world looks at the church, it should see a community of faith where leaders serve instead of swagger, where the weak are nourished instead of cast aside, where people who lose their way are not forgotten, but sought and restored, and where people cultivate mercy and forgiveness as if they were the rare flowers of heaven. Indeed, it is true. The Church of Jesus Christ should be distinguished by the quality of its life, by its depth, and by its breadth. It is with all of that in mind that we move to a careful look at the story from Matthew's Gospel. It follows immediately upon a text in which Jesus speaks about settling disputes in the church. That process involves public confession and forgiveness publicly offered by the church. It is an opportunity for everyone to understand where wrong has been done and how that wrong can be righted. It is not surprising, then, that Peter leads off with a question in today's story. He says, "Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times?" Now, Peter thinks he's done well in throwing out the number 7, because you will probably remember that 7 is regarded as a number of completion throughout Scripture. And it is far more than the 3 times the rabbinic tradition calls for forgiveness of a single person for the same offense. Jesus responds with a number that seems more like infinity. He says, not 7 times, but I tell you, 70 times 7, or some translations say 77 times. And then Jesus continues with a story that requires a great deal of imagination from us. Jesus conjures a situation in which the slave owes the king a huge sum, an amount akin in our time to a minimum wage worker owing Bill Gates $10 million. So repayment is clearly impossible. It could never happen. So the king orders the slave and his family to be sold and the debt paid with the proceeds as far as it would go. But the slave falls on his knees and begs the king to give him time to repay the debt. Still an impossibility. But instead of working out a payment plan, the king forgives the debt. Bill Gates forgives a $10 million debt. There is no working forever to get back in the good graces of the king. There are no conditions, no qualifications. The debt, the debilitating debt, is erased from the ledger and from the memory of the king. The slave begins anew with a clean slate. And with the words of forgiveness still ringing in his ears, the forgiven slave, remembering that he is owed a very small debt by a fellow slave, rushes to collect it. He takes the man by the throat and demands the money, knowing that the fellow slave does not have it. And the once forgiven slave has his peer thrown into debtor's prison. The king summons the one for whom he has forgiven a massive debt and asked him, "Should you have not had mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you?" Forgiveness is at the very heart of who God is. Because of God's great generosity to us in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, we are freed to fully be God's people. Every Sunday morning, just as we did today, following the prayer of confession, we say together, "In Jesus Christ, we are forgiven." And it is true. Our $10 million owed to the King has been erased. We are forgiven. I consider that moment, the moment in which we recognize and claim as a community the very forgiveness that God aches to give us, to be the theological climax of worship. Think about it. God knows all about us, and God stands ready to forgive. God recognizes sin in our lives that we don't yet recognize, and God stands ready to forgive. God knows all there is to know, and God stands ready to forgive. Though we will, of necessity, confess a particular sin today, and then maybe even again tomorrow and the next day, and maybe 7 more times, or even 70 times 7 more times, God stands ready to forgive. Not one of us could stand before God without the saving love of Jesus Christ. Receiving the forgiveness of God makes it possible for that forgiveness to overflow into our own relationships within the community of faith, and in our families, and in our world. Today's text is principally about the nature of God and the character of people like us, the church. God's people are meant to be a uniquely forgiving people. People who concern themselves with the specks in their own eyes rather than the planks that they so easily see in the eyes of their neighbors. Tom Long says it this way: "We know too well that the little boat in which we are sailing is floating on a deep sea of grace." We know the little boat in which we are sailing is floating on a deep sea of grace. Therefore, our forgiveness is not to be dispensed with an eyedropper, but with a fire hose. Peter generously suggests 7 as an appropriate number of times to forgive someone. Jesus is thinking bigger, much bigger, 70 times 7 times or 77 times. But keeping up with the number alone is a challenge. Walking endlessly on the treadmill of remembering sins, our own or those of another, wears us out. Hoarding forgiveness separates us from others and from our own best selves. I think that is what Jesus is getting at. Scorekeeping distracts us from the gifts we have received from God in Jesus Christ. Scorekeeping robs us of joy, and we forget who we are. We forget the one to whom we belong. We forget that we live and move and have our being in a God whose forgiveness is poured out like an ever-flowing stream. The church is conceived as a colony of heaven. And Alexander Pope said, "To err is human, to forgive divine." We draw close to God, and we draw close to one another when we share the forgiveness we have received from God. And so it is that we begin to live into the reality that we really are a community of God's people, created in God's image. Our little boat floats on a deep sea of grace. May we invite others into that grace by dispensing forgiveness in large measure. We are held steady in the storm by a God who forgives and remembers our sin no more. May we go and do likewise. Amen.